Jorge Luis Borges' short story, The Cult of the Phoenix, is indeed very short, but very suggestive. And he sort of speaks into existence, or rather writes into existence, a vast intergenerational organization centered around a ritual that will stay in existence, according to the story, throughout all eternity. And of course, this is a fiction, but it's interesting what you can do with language by suggesting something like this. Not quite into full being, but at least you could say literary being. And so it begins by talking about the Cult of the Phoenix, some saying it had its origin in Heliopolis and that it derives from the religious restoration that followed the death of the reformer Amenhotep. They cite the writings of Herodotus and Tacitus and inscriptions on Egyptian monuments, but they're unaware, he says, perhaps willfully unaware, that the cult's designation as the Cult of the Phoenix, one of the key terms for it, can be traced back no farther than to Rabanus Maurus that the earliest sources, the Saturnalia, say, or Flavius Josephus, speak only of two other terms, two terms that are really much more applicable: the people of the practice or the people of the secret. And the narrator says, I've had conversations with people who belong to it, who didn't understand me when I asked whether they were men of the Phoenix, but immediately admitted to being men of the secret. So Cult of the Phoenix is what other people who don't really know about it call it, but the people involved in it have these sort of commonplace terms. And then he's going to talk about two sets of possible comparisons that actually turn out to be contrasts. Some people want to say that the cult or the sect of the practice or of the secret are sort of like the Roma, or they're sort of like the Jewish people. So he talks about this scholar Maklosich, who equated the members of the Cult of the Phoenix with the Roma, saying in Chile and in Hungary there are both Roma and members of the sect apart from their ubiquity. However, the two groups have very little in common, the narrator is telling us. Why? Because Roma are horse traders, pot makers, blacksmiths, and fortune tellers. The members of the Cult of the Phoenix are generally contented practitioners of the liberal professions. Roma are of a certain physical type and speak or used to speak a secret language. Members of the cult are indistinguishable from other men. And the proof of this is they have never been persecuted, something we'll come back to in just a bit. Roma are picturesque and often inspire bad poets, ballads, photographs, and boleros. Fail to mention the members of the cult. So clearly that comparison doesn't hold up. What about to the Jewish people? He invokes Martin Buber, saying that Jews are essentially sufferers. Well, not all the members of the cult are, and some actively abhor pathos. That public and well-known truth suffices to refute the vulgar error which sees the roots of the Phoenix as lying in Israel. And so the narrator is going to reconstruct that line of reasoning like this. Erman was a sensitive man. Erman was a Jew. Erman made a habit of visiting the members of the cult in the Jewish ghettos of Prague. The affinity that Erman sensed proves a real relationship. And then the narrator says, well, I can't agree with that conclusion. That the members of the cult should, in a Jewish milieu, resemble Jews proves nothing, because go anywhere else and they resemble the people of that group, because they do belong to that group. So go to China, they're going to resemble Chinese, right? But they're still people of the practice or of the secret. So those comparisons don't really work. And he goes on to say, what cannot be denied is that they, the people, resemble every man in the world. They are all things to all men, like the apostle. Just a few days ago, Dr. Juan Francisco Amara pondered the ease with which they assimilate, the ease with they naturalize themselves. And even that might be off base because, as we're going to find out, because of this ritual, they don't actually have to assimilate. They're already there wherever they happen to be initiated. So the concept of assimilation is even off. So what can we say about these people then? We read further on that the only thing that actually unites them and binds them together as a people is the secret itself that unites them and will unite them to the end of time, he will say. And so what does this actually tell us? Going back a little bit, bringing up the persecution thing, he says, I have said the history of the cult records no persecutions. Nobody has ever persecuted the cult as such. And this is very different to the Roma or the Jews who have encountered a lot of persecution from a variety of different angles. But since members of the cult belong to practically every society, civilization, and culture, there is no persecution, he says, that they haven't taken part in, carried out, and suffered any persecution or severity. He says, in the wars of the Western world and the distant wars of Asia, their blood has been spilled for centuries under enemy flags. It's hardly worth their while to identify themselves with every nation on the globe. So the secret unites them. Well, what is the secret then? He tells us that in the past there was a legend and possibly a cosmogonic myth, right? A story of origins, you could say. But the superficial men of the Phoenix have forgotten it. Today, all that is left to them is the dim and obscure story of a punishment. But then he changes his tune. Could be a punishment. It could also be a pact or a privilege. Versions differ. But what one may dimly see in all of them is the judgment of a God who promises eternity to a race of beings if its men, generation upon generation, perform a certain ritual. Now, that's interesting because that makes it sound sort of like a mystery religion promising immortality. Notice a very important twist there. It's not just that I, as a member of the cult, participate in the ritual and thereby ensure my own personal immortality, but an immortality with all the other members of the cult. There is also, at least in the way it's worded, sort of a promise, but also a threat. You'd better keep this going, or else maybe it falls through for everybody. Let me read that sentence one more time. Promises eternity to a race of beings if its men, generation upon generation, perform a certain ritual. And he goes on and he says, I've compared travelers' reports, I've spoken with patriarchs and theologians. I can attest that the performance of that ritual is the only religious practice observed by members of the cult. The ritual is, in fact, the secret. So to talk about the ritual or practice or the secret is to talk about the same thing. You become initiated in it by undergoing the ritual, by experiencing the secret. And so he says, the secret, as I have said, is transmitted from generation to generation. And who can do it? Not priests, not a mother for her child. Initiation into the mystery is the task of the lowest individuals of the group. A slave, a leper, or a beggar plays the role of mystagogue, and a child may catechize another child. And it's a simple act. It requires just a few material elements: cork, wax, or gum arabic. In the liturgy, there's mention of slime. Pond slime is often used as well. There are no temples. Ruins, cellars, or entryways are considered appropriate sites. The secret is sacred, but that doesn't prevent it being a bit ridiculous. Its performance is furtive, even clandestine, and its adepts do not speak of it. Now, here is a really interesting observation. There are no decent words by which to call it. So to speak of it directly is an obscenity, a blasphemy, something bad. However, the men of the secret, the people of the secret, say that all words somehow name it. So a person can be talking of the secret without even intending to or knowing that there are. The narrator says, I have said some insignificant thing in conversation and seen adepts smile or grow uncomfortable because they sensed I had touched upon the secret. There's poems that are symbols of the secret. And then we read about two interesting groups of people. So we've got the run-of-the-mill people of the secret, and then we have some for whom sacred horror keeps them from performing the ritual. And he says they are despised and they despise themselves. Now, it would really only apply if they were called upon to perform the ritual, so they would have to be the lowest individuals, right? But then there's others who leave behind or renounce the practice and aim for and achieve direct commerce with the deity. And he says that they are held in great respect. And then that people like that speak of the commerce using figures from the liturgy. And we have this nice little quote from John of the Rood, an imaginary person. Let the 9 firmaments be told that God is delightful as the cork and mire, right? And we end on some really interesting paradoxical ideas about the cult of the phoenix. He says, I know that the secret at first struck them as banal, shameful, vulgar, and strangers still unbelievable. They could not bring themselves to admit their parents had ever stooped to such acts. But of course, they become initiated, and now they're part of it. And he says, it's odd. The secret did not die out long ago, but it has lasted and come to all of the faithful. And then he finishes by saying that some have dared to claim that by now it is instinctive, which would imply that it has become part of whatever you want to call it, a undergirding of culture tied in with instinct, something like a collective unconscious, whatever it is that would be sustaining it in that case. Now, the narrator doesn't actually say that it is merely instinctive, just that some claim that. So we end on sort of an interesting paradoxical note for this very short story about an imaginary cult which could exist, but we have no evidence for it existing other than the narrative framework of this short story.